Hey, MBA hopefuls. We are on air with MBA Waves, your weekly webcast talking all things business and education, streaming live every Tuesday on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube, bringing you tons of tips to help you into a top ranked MBA program. And if you like this week's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Today, on episode number 130, we are going to get to the nuts and bolts of the round two MBA interview. We're going to talk about everything you need to know to prep for them, some best tips, and of course, some mistakes to avoid. I'm your host for today, Krithika Srinivasan, joined by my co hosts, Eric and Bara. Hey, how are you?
Hello.
Hello, hello.
And we have a special guest today, our close friend and colleague, Nupur Gupta from Crack the MBA, past AIGAC president and Wharton Alumna. A very big welcome to you, Nupur.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. And Krithika, Eric, Bara, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's such a pleasure.
Good to see you again.
Always.
It's great to see you.
Thank you. I remember last time I had the privilege of being here with Adam when we spoke about AIGAC. And it's so nice to meet with AIGAC buddies once again.
Yes.
Always.
Go to the conference this May here in Paris, Barcelona.
Awesome.
Cannot
so
wait.
jumping right in to the topic, we all know that the application process for business school is like full of hoops. So what role do you think the interview plays in the business school application process?
Absolutely. Happy to share, Krithika. So there's multiple things that I believe an interview helps to accomplish. For instance, it helps to assess fit with the school's culture, values. It helps evaluate feasibility of a candidate's career goals, given the school's resources, network. It helps the interviewer evaluate what kind of brand ambassador the candidate would be at the school and for the school. It also helps to assess how a candidate would represent themselves in job interviews, that placements being extremely important, recruiting being important at schools. Then it would also help to check the credibility of the application that a candidate might have submitted, specifically for applications for interviews where applications are read in advance. And then they may also help to demonstrate a candidate's ability to think on their feet, which can be an important aspect through an MBA program and also in future leadership roles. So I think these are a few aspects. And of course, there are other things as well.
Yeah, definitely the moment to see how they think on their feet. That's something that the schools are looking for, all those soft skills that are beyond that GMAT score and so forth. Would you say there's anything that makes round two interviews different from other rounds? Or is it the same? What is your position on that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Eric. I'm assuming you are talking about US schools specifically when you speak about round two. Is that correct?
So yeah, usually rounds 1, 2, and 3 have kind of their fixed timeline in the US, right? Or at least North America. So it's kind of September, January, and then in March. But then when you look at Europe or some other places, it might be a little bit different. So you can take it how you want.
Okay, fair. All right. So the way I look at it, I think from the school's standpoint, it's more or less the same. They are looking to have the same kind of platform, and they're looking to evaluate candidates based on equitable circumstances. So I don't believe the interviews are different according to rounds. However, when we look at it from the applicant standpoint, there could be the added pressure of needing to perform well, because generally R1 and R2 are considered the holy grail of rounds for admissions to US business schools. So I think that probably could be one difference, so to speak.
For sure. Like if you're...
I'm curious how you all think about it, if you think there are other differences as well.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely some differences in the rounds if you're looking later than round two, right? Often, what our AIGAC colleagues references that rounds 1 and 2, not too much difference between the two. But when you get to round 3, there's definitely a lot of places taken up already. So there's not as many seats left over if you're applying as an international student, or, I hate that term because like everyone's international, right? But if you're applying to a school in a country where you're not from, you have to think about visas, and it gets a little bit more complicated. So as an international student, I definitely recommend going for the first 2 rounds.
Right. Okay. Are we talking about it just from the perspective of applying or from the perspective of interviews? Because my answer would be different if it's also from the perspective of applying R1 versus R2.
So what I just said, I guess, is more about applying. But since today we're focusing on interviews, let's hear what you have to say about interview.
Okay. Fair.
Okay, so I've got a question here. Like, let's get to brass tacks. What are the ingredients of a great interview, and how should a person prepare for it?
Right. Absolutely. That's a great and very important question, Bara. So thank you so much for bringing that up. The ingredients of a great interview, enthusiasm, I think, is key. One of the most important ingredients, I would say. Content, another important ingredient. Clarity, concision. So I think all of these are some great components, integral components of a great interview. And we can drill down a little bit as well here, right? I think practice can really help with the communication aspect of the interview. So if somebody has practiced and they've also had some mock interviews, then they'd be probably more confident, which can also help them have a great interview. Research that shows up, when you talk about the school, the resources, how those fit in with your career goals. Speaking about students you've spoken to and relevant things you've learned along the way. So I think very briefly, those are some components. And of course, I'd be happy to delve deeper, based on follow-up questions you may have.
Well, I'm curious, you mentioned practice, right? So what is the best way to actually practice for an interview? Do you want to do it with a peer? Do you want to find friends who have gone through business school, or how do you create both the tension and the unknown that sometimes happens, but also be prepared for what they'll probably ask you about?
Right. That's a great question. Thanks for that, Bara. So I think there's multiple ways in which candidates can practice. There's definitely the practice with a buddy, which you spoke of, right? And which could be somebody who, let's say, maybe was a senior colleague at work or a senior from college even. So those could be some great avenues, because they are people who are already at your target school and they understand the culture presumably, and they'd have a sense for what kind of interview you could expect to have from their own experience as well as from hearing about it with their peers and classmates. So that's definitely one way you could go about it. Then another way could be, as you mentioned, with a co-applicant. Having said that, I believe they're still in the process, so their experience could be lower than somebody who's already successfully gone through the process. And so for me, I would consider that a rung lower than students at your target schools. Another way you could go about it could be by working with experts. So that's another way. And then another thing I've heard about is sometimes people find folks who are willing to interview them, through online forums. So those could be great avenues as well. It could also be somebody at work who is an alum from the school. So I think those are some avenues that I can think of.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It helps to have all those different options in front of you. But I think what's more important is, as you said, bringing that aspect of practice. And this brings us to another assumption here, right? Every B school is not made equal. There are so many different formats, so many different logistics involved, who interviews you, where it happens, how it happens, the mode, the means, and everything else. So can you look at the differences and the impact it has on the preparation for the interview?
Yeah, happy to do that, Krithika. There's a few categories of interviews, and this may not be a comprehensive list, but I'm speaking primarily of the major categories. So we have the resume-based or blind interviews, right, which are conducted by many business schools, for instance, Kellogg, Chicago Booth, Columbia. And basically, this is the kind of interview where the interviewer will only have access to your resume, and based on that, they're conducting interviews. So that's one category of interviews. Then we have the application-based interviews. Here, the interviewer has already gone through your application file. For instance, at Harvard, at London Business School, those are just a couple examples where they have that. Then we have the video interviews. These could be impromptu, wherein you do not know the prompt in advance, and in other cases, you may know the prompt in advance. For example, at Berkeley Haas, we have video interviews as well. And then we have presentation-based interviews. For instance, at HSA, at London Business School, we have presentation-based interviews. So those are a few kind of interview formats. And of course, there's the team-based discussion as well, which Wharton has, for example. Preparation plays a key role in each of these instances. I do think that specifically for the application-based interviews, it requires a different kind of preparation where you have to know your application inside out. There could be a minor point mentioned somewhere where you may not even have thought twice about it, and you could get a question based on that. So it's important to just print out your application, go through that multiple times so that you don't miss out on anything which you've said. That's about the application-based interviews. With the resume-based interviews, definitely you want to print out your resume, go through each and every line in detail, and come up with anecdotes even based on the bullet points that are available. For video interviews, I think it is helpful to record yourself and watch those videos to see how you're coming across. Sometimes it can also be helpful to practice in front of a mirror because you're also getting live feedback. So I find that to be a really helpful way as well. And I've seen a lot of improvement using that. With presentation-based interviews, I think there's multiple things that matter, right? It's the styling of it does matter, the formatting and whatnot. One thing I have seen is that my clients who are in management consulting tend to find these easier versus those who aren't from that background. Maybe they're from finance backgrounds. So give yourself some time to prepare those presentations as well. Maybe you can get some support from your consultant friends. And also these days, there are really nice tools like Canva, which you can use for graphics, and that can be really helpful as well. So yeah, in terms of preparation, I think you'd have to prepare based on the specific format, which definitely would require different kind of preparation. Like for a resume-based interview, that might be quicker in terms of preparation versus, say, an application-based interview, which I think might require more preparation.
I definitely think it's about finding the right balance between preparing, because on one hand, the more you prepare, the more comfortable, the more confident you're going to feel, but also not overthinking it, right? So there's a certain fine line to be found. And I'm definitely a fan of, doing it first. I think in front of a mirror is a good way to do it, but also recording yourself, because then you can see how you appear for sure on camera. Like you might have a little nervous habit you're not aware of, and then you can say, I'm doing that. Maybe I'll avoid that next time. Doing a lot of or tapping or something to, where our stress manifests. Also a good idea to do with a real person, like you said, alum or a trusted colleague, perhaps. But in any case, I think it's super important to really know what you're getting into. And as always, the website of each school usually is the first place to go. It's kind of like your Bible, right? And it's sort of, it's your responsibility to know that website inside and out, first of all, but you can probably glean a lot of clues about what you can expect during the interview. But also talking with the recruiter, alumni, current students, ask what their experiences were, and you can really get a good handle on. But I think it's also worth mentioning that some schools employ alumni or other people to help in the interview process, especially the schools that are interviewing everyone. It is like McCombs famously interviews every single applicant, and they pride themselves in giving that opportunity to every applicant. So the way you would speak to an alum versus a current student versus professional staff is going to be different, of course. So, the kinds of things that they'll be aware of or are looking for are going to be different. So you want to respond and prepare accordingly.
Yeah,
those are some great points, Eric.
Yeah, one thing I really like about the practice in front of the mirror or even the recording is that people come and say, I never thought that I sounded like that. Or I never thought that I was having this mannerism or something that you said. So great points.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the
very
team-based
true.
discussion at Wharton, right? The TBD, the famous Wharton interview process. Hey, you're a Wharton alum. You've gone through this, I assume. I'm not sure when you were there, but was that process in place when you were at Wharton?
Actually, it wasn't. So that process was put in place, I believe, in 2013 or 2014. So I'd already graduated by then, so I didn't have an opportunity to participate in the TBD.
Nonetheless, I'm sure you're pretty aware of how it works. Would you like to share about that very particular experience?
Yeah, I'd be glad to share about how candidates can excel in the TBD as well. So TBD is very different, TBD or the team-based discussion, different from other formats, and it's very dynamic in nature. So one thing which I have seen with clients is that they may have done really extremely poorly in like a mock team-based discussion session, but they may just excel in the actual TBD. So I'd say even if you're doing poorly, do not stress out. It's very possible that you'll do just fine and you'll do really well in the actual TBD. So generally the way it works is there's 5 or 6 people who are together in a TBD, and there's 2 second-year students who are overseeing the TBD itself. And the TBD, you're given a prompt, and then, like for example, they may ask you to come up with a course, and they may ask you to come up with, let's say, learning objectives, evaluation criteria, and name of the course, region, topic, that sort of thing. And then you'll have to pitch your idea. You'll have about a minute to pitch, and everybody will pitch their ideas, followed by a 25-minute discussion, which will be timed. And that's followed by a 5-minute presentation, which will again be timed. So that's broadly the format of the team-based discussion for folks who are not familiar with it. And the TBD is thereafter followed by personal interviews, which are 10 minutes long a piece. And when it comes to preparing for the TBD itself, I do believe it's helpful to go for a couple of mock sessions. I think that can be incredibly useful, because even by participating, by virtue of participating, you get to see what kind of persona is coming out as you're participating, and that gives you an opportunity to adjust your approach. That's something I've seen people do frequently. It also gives you an opportunity to test out your ideas, because as you talk aloud, you may realize that something that you were previously thinking, it sounded great when you were thinking about it, but maybe it doesn't sound so great as you say it out loud. So that can be helpful as well. I've seen cases where people pre-think of certain roles that they may adopt through the TBD. For instance, somebody may volunteer to be a timekeeper, somebody may volunteer to be the synthesizer, or not volunteer, but they may think in their head that they may synthesize the ideas and help keep the discussion on track. Somebody may be ideating along the way. So there are different roles that people may take on, or it could be a mix of different approaches, different roles. The key thing is, I believe, to help advance the team and to think and act in the best interest of the team. The idea is not to shine through or shine out, and sort of have the limelight, so to speak, have center stage. That's definitely not the idea. It is to advance the cause of the group as a whole. I know I've been talking a lot.
The name of the experience I'm so sorry. There's a little delay. The name of the experience says it all, right? It is a team-based discussion, right? So no one should be dominating, right? You mentioned the pitch. I wanted to follow up with you because you started speaking about the pitch, and a lot of people will get upset or panic if their pitch isn't taken. And like, could you just explain what goes into preparing the pitch, and what is it? Maybe you have an example you want to share. What could you tell us about that?
Right. No, thanks, Eric. That's a great question. So yeah, just taking the example of a course, right? I believe there was a prompt sometime back where Wharton has these courses, something called a GMC. So the idea was to come up with a new course, a new GMC. And so one way that candidates would like to approach this is you want to see what's already on offer. So that's one way you can go about your research. And then you can think about what's relevant, what's the objective of this course, and what would be relevant for students to have an opportunity to study. And that could be an area based on which they come up with a pitch, or it could also be based on something which the candidate has prior experience with, and they know that that's something they can speak knowledgeably about. So those are some ways in which they can research pitch ideas. And then there's, as I was saying, there's certain criteria. There's, like, for example, the name of the course, faculty who may be advising or involved with that, and learning objectives. And there's a few other things. So you prepare that and you make sure that your pitch captures those ideas, and you time yourself. You want to practice yourself and have yourself be within 55 seconds or so that, even if you exceed the time, you can complete it within a minute, which is the time that's allotted to each individual to say their pitch.
Yeah, one thing I really like about TBD and also ESA's assessment day, and even Ross had like one of those exercises, is that it comes closest to what happens in an actual business school classroom. And this best simulation ever. So for some people who might feel that, hey, like especially for ESA, for example, that may not be what they're suited for, or like a full case-based stuff, and of course, like if some feel that they're not up to the rigor of the business school setting, they can always reevaluate their strategies and then also decide what they want to do.
Yeah, that's a really great point as well, Krithika. I completely agree with you.
And Nupur, one last question. I don't want to focus too much on Wharton, although it is a very targeted school. How important would you say is creativity when you're coming up with your pitch?
That's a great question, Eric. I'm not sure, to be honest with you, how important creativity is. I have seen cases where candidates have had pitches which are not necessarily creative, but they are robust regardless, because they're answering all parts of the question and they've done well, they've been admitted. So while you perhaps rewarded for creativity, I'm not sure if it's a prerequisite.
When I see these shows like Shark Tank and Dragon or whatever that's called, like I think people are more and more inspired to come up with something absolutely wild that's attention grabbing and, for the pitch part. But then it's, tapering that when it comes to the team discussion part, right? Anyway.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's not necessary that, your pitch would be selected, right? So yeah, let's keep that in mind as well.
Right. We don't need to get meta, but I do want to mention that, ultimately the format of MBA Waves is kind of like an interview, right? And we're sitting here and Nupur is doing such an amazing job in modeling great interview skills, right? After each thing that we ask her, she is somehow either thanking us or repeating the question. So those probably are really good processes when you're in the interview itself. So for our listeners, this is really good modeling that you're also getting. I'm also curious though, what are some of the big mistakes and no-nos that happen during the process that we can warn people to avoid?
Gosh, you're making me blush, Bara. Thank you so much for the compliment. Yeah. Definitely would like to speak about some mistakes as well. One thing I've been seeing a lot recently is specifically with COVID and Zoom interviews becoming the norm, is that candidates will have notes and cheat sheets on their screen, and then they'll be scrolling and they'll be looking things up during the interview. And that, I believe, is a no-no, because for the interviewer, it shows through right away, and it also limits your ability to be present with the interviewer.
Absolutely.
So that, I believe, is a huge mistake. I don't know if you have noticed that as well, the three of you.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's so irritating to see as if you're reading a subtitle. Or maybe you have like something on the screen and your eyes are moving elsewhere. But I also think it's probably because people are not so used to looking at the camera. They probably want to see the other person on the screen, like now. So that's also something with a few people who are not that used to having Zoom interviews as part of their regular work. So I've seen that happen too.
Yeah, that's a good point, Krithika. And one thing I also had somebody tell me was that they were using two screens, and just the way they were making eye contact made it look like they're like reading off of something. So they're like, oh, I'm definitely going to take care of that for the actual interview.
Yeah, eye contact, I think, is super important. It's about engagement. It's about connection. It just feels a bit weird when somebody's not giving you that eye contact, even though it's super unnatural. Because like, I want to look at you, Nupur, you're speaking, and I'm looking at your face right now, but now I'm looking at the camera. So I usually tell people, like, you can put a little Post-it with an arrow to remind you to keep those eyeballs on that camera as much as you can to have that connection.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've been looking at your faces as well. So I missed the sticky note. Should have had that on. And speaking of another one is lack of enthusiasm. And that's something I touched upon earlier as well. I believe it's a mistake when candidates are missing that. So even for mock interviews, I would recommend treating those as actual interviews. I love it when people actually dress up for the mock interviews as well. I've had people show up in like literally a suit, tie, and whatnot as well, because they wanted to treat it like their actual interview, which was great. And they simulated the exact same environment, which was amazing as well. With coming back to the enthusiasm part, one other thing, which may not be very common, but I still wanted to bring it up because I've seen that with a specific demographic. I primarily work with a lot of Indian candidates, and that can be a highly competitive candidate pool. So candidates also end up applying to multiple schools. So they'll have, let's say, they'll have some dream schools. They'll also have schools which they would think of as perhaps safety schools. And one thing I've seen is that when interviewing with those safety schools, candidates may not prepare as much and they may not be as enthusiastic, which I think is a mistake, because then you're not giving yourself a fair chance to get in. You're also not learning about the school if you're not doing your research. And who knows, maybe once you research the school, you may actually like it better. Which is something I've definitely seen happen with people. I've had somebody who applied to London Business School as their dream school, and then Tuck was a safety school. But when they got into both and they got to learn about the school, they actually ended up going to Tuck instead. So I do believe there's merit in learning about schools nicely as well.
Makes me laugh to think about Tuck as a safety school. It's a very good school.
You'd be surprised, Eric. You'd be really surprised.
Everyone comes with their prejudices, their opinions, and then it's exactly what you said. I couldn't agree more. Like, go deep in that research and treat each school equally. I know it's even at the application stage. Round one, Harvard is famously usually the first, or if not one of the first, and so they put so much into that application, and then they have like 30% bandwidth for the other schools they're applying to, and like, you kind of want to give as much equal treatment as possible and to go deep, because then you know more. You will focus your energy better, and it will show that you've put in that effort and made connections and really well researched those schools. You don't want to, I don't know, it's like going on a date and you're like, you're not really interested.
Exactly. That's a good analogy, I believe. Yeah. And I wanted to mention one or two more things. I think preparing your answers such that they're within a minute and a half or 2 minutes, that I think can be helpful. And there's some exceptions where you may even want to be more concise. For example, with Harvard, you want to be even more concise. This I found people can struggle with because they really they have so much to say, so they can ramble at times. So this, I believe, would be critical. And then relying on the same story, that I think is a mistake as well. So it's important to prepare multiple anecdotes so that you have different examples to share for different questions. You don't want to appear unidimensional. So I think this can be critical as well.
If I may comment, I really agree with those 2 points. Like, getting to the point is such a skill. And, most people applying for MBAs, they have a lot to say. They've had some great experiences. But as you said, practicing and getting responses down to a minute and a half or less than a minute is great. Look at the Harvard, the requirement to have the resume or CV max 1 page. Like, they want you to be concise. I like the quote from Teddy Roosevelt. He said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." You don't say much, but what you say has impact, really stands out. And I forgot the other thing that you were saying that I also agreed with.
The story, having multiple stories.
Yeah, exactly. Like, a lot of people are panicking because I don't know what they're going to ask. And like, you do actually, they're going to ask about you. They want to know about you, the star of this show, right? And they want to know certain things. They want to know about your ability to be a team player, leadership experiences, having impact. I would say even things like humility and empathy. So think of at least 3 or 4 examples that you have in your bank of stories that you can just pull out like a rabbit out of a magic hat. When you can tell, okay, this is what they're going for here. Like, it might not be so cut and dry. Like, sometimes the questions are a little bit meandering, or you have to read between the lines. But it's like, okay, this is an impact question, or this is a leadership question, and just pull one of those prepared stories. But again, I want to say, don't overdo it. Don't over prepare so it comes out robotic, like you are reading, even if you're not. I think that's where the enthusiasm can make up for the preparation. That sounds and rehearsed.
Yeah, and just wanted to add to what you mentioned, Eric. You talked about having 3 or 4 stories, right, in your bank. I do think that's great to have, even if somebody wants to prepare, say, 5 or 6 stories, that's okay. But I do think it's helpful to have fewer rather than too many stories, but prepare those few stories really well, because chances are that, those would be your most impactful stories. And if you prepare a separate story for every question, when you get asked a question where you have a less impactful story, you don't want to dilute your impact. So you want to use your most impactful stories right from the get-go. So that's why I do think it's helpful to have fewer stories rather than many, because more often than not, you can use one story across multiple questions.
Yeah, and hearing you both speak, I thought of this, that some people go into the interview thinking it's a testing, like another test like the GRE or something. But instead, if they consider this to be an opportunity for a conversation about themselves and sharing their aspiration, their interests, who they are, and other things, it becomes so much better.
Indeed. And you might even want to adjust some of those stories depending on the school. Knowing the values and what is important, what is the culture of that school. You might not tell exactly the same stories or experiences depending on the school you're talking to in that particular interview.
Right. Absolutely.
And we tossed around stories so many times. So Nupur, what's your favorite interview story?
So I don't know if I necessarily have a favorite story, but there is one that I distinctly recall. It's from a candidate who was interviewing with ISB, or the Indian School of Business, which some of us are visiting next week, actually, some AIGAC folks. So that should be fun. This candidate was an economics major undergrad and was being interviewed by a panel of, I believe, 3 interviewers who were mostly alumni. So given the candidate's economics major, one of the interviewers asked him to solve a problem, an equation, just on the spot during the interview. And the candidate did that. And then the interviewer was like, "You're wrong." And the candidate stuck to his guns, and they must have discussed it for some 15 or 30 minutes. And eventually the interviewer told him, "You're wrong, but let's just move on in the interest of time." And they had the interview for another 30 minutes or so. And at the end of the interview, just as the candidate was walking out, the interviewer said to him, "By the way, you were right about that equation. I was just testing to see how strongly you stand up for your convictions." So that story stayed with me. And generally, such incidents won't happen. Specifically, I believe for US schools, we generally don't see such things. But I still wanted to share that, because it's helpful to stand up for your convictions. I'm curious to hear, like, are there some memorable stories that the 3 of you have that you may want to share?
I don't usually work with students on the interviews so much, except sometimes I will get clients who are going into interviews and they're feeling nervous, right? They've done all the things, but they've got the jitters, right? So the only kinds of stories I hear about with them is after the fact, that they actually felt really confident and focused and together. So, but I love that story. That happens in real life too sometimes. Like, someone will just kind of push and say, "You're wrong." And it's like, okay, how do you handle someone when they're telling you that you're wrong when you actually know that you're right? And so it's an interesting, and what do you do if you're working for a company and your boss is telling you that you're wrong, right? So these are all skills, once again, that are mirrored in normal, everyday, professional and personal life, that the better you get at them, and the more nuanced and present you can be, the better.
Yeah, very true. Very true, Bara.
Just to share, it's not a specific story, but sometimes you hear more, I would say, horror stories of, like, sometimes alumni interviews aren't the best experience because these people are not, professional people who do interviewing. They're helping at the school. And I think it's a great thing when schools engage alumni, by doing these interviews, they're kind of still in touch with the incoming students. They're going to be among the ranks of alumni if they're admitted and so forth. But sometimes the experience isn't so great. Like, maybe it goes really short. You're like, that took 20 minutes. That didn't seem right. Or he seemed to be agitated or something like that, he or she. And I think if it's a really negative experience, you can get in touch with the admissions office and let them know that this didn't feel right. And, often they'll give you someone else to interview with because perhaps it wasn't a proper experience. But at the end of the day, they're not the ones making the decisions. They have like a mark sheet. They're going to fill out some kind of rubric and they'll hand it off to the admissions. And often there's a professional staff interviewing after the fact anyway. So that can be hard with the alumni interviews. But again, the way you treat those is not exactly the same as you would if it was professional staff.
And how about you, Krithika? Do you have an interview share?
I was just thinking about this one, one candidate who was very nervous and who came from a very different background, a government background, and hadn't really worked in corporate world.
Oh, I think she froze.
She's frozen.
She's frozen.
Okay, so this is a good point. Like, when your camera freezes or your internet connection goes down during the interview, this is something that's kind of, it stinks, right? Oh, Krithika's back. We're just talking about
sorry about that. Yeah,
but,
I was able to hear the lesson you gave about handling the technical
If you're
issues.
somewhere in the world where you don't necessarily have a great connection, it might be worth it to book a space. Like some people book a room in a hotel, a conference room, or in a library or somewhere you're sure to have silence and no interruptions and a strong internet connection, because it does really kind of sour the experience if you keep getting cut off, if you can't understand each other. It's stressful and just doesn't make it a pleasant experience for everyone. But anyway, Krithika, please continue with what you were saying.
I was just saying that, this person came from a very different background and not from the corporate world. And he said after the interview, he said, like, this is the first time that I felt that I was heard in the process. Because till then, you're writing essays and everything else. You just seem to have like a distance between you and of course, like the business school classroom, right? But the interview is as close as you get to actually envisioning your life in the business school and so on. So he said, like, after this is where I felt like, yeah, I belong. Even if I don't get into this particular school, I would love to try and make it to some school. So I always like feel that that gets you closer to the dream.
Oh yeah. Sure.
So I like this round robin that we've done. I want to follow up with asking people, what is one thing you think that the listeners can implement immediately going into and acing the MBA interview?
I think two things we talked about, which I believe listeners can implement immediately. One was recording yourself and viewing those recordings for self-improvement and practicing in front of a mirror. So that's my contribution.
Nice. Krithika?
You stole the best one. No, I would say not to have too many rehearsed scripts. So people get into the habit of like, tell me about yourself, walk me through your resume. I'm going to go through this point 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of a thing. And they forget point number 3. And then they're like, drawing a blank in the interview. So I would say don't go too rehearsed. You want to kind of know what is the area that you want to cover, but you don't want to be reading off a script or like, it's not a speech.
Right. Fully agree. All right, I'll share something. So with my clients, I often share this, not YouTube, well, it's on YouTube as well, a TED Talk by a guy named Julian Treasure. And he does this talk. It's called something like How to Speak So That Other People Will Be Interested or something like that. And he does these warm-ups with the audience. Like he gets everyone up on their feet and repeating what he does and like doing this thing like getting the tongue moving and like getting the lungs and the air flowing and all this kind of stuff. Not only does this help take care of nerves, because when you're in an interview, most people are at least a little bit nervous. And if you're very nervous, maybe you get into some meditation or yoga beforehand. But it also, loosens up the mouth, the tongue, and just the whole, expression of your voice. And speaking of voice, he gives like very clear examples on how you can have like a more confident, richer, and kind of soothing voice that conveys not authority, but that you know what you're talking about and that you're feeling comfortable and you're happy to be there, and it creates engagement. So I really like this video that he does that I systematically share with my clients when they're at the interview stage as just a first step in getting to feel comfortable before we do our recorded simulations together.
I'm going to follow up with that with saying that some of the intangibles, like your voice, like your background, like what you're wearing, how do you envision yourself going into the interview feeling super confident? What are you going to wear? Are you going to wear a power suit? Are you going to wear something comfortable? Will you have time to do your hair? How are you going to go in so you just feel really great? And so that is just the baseline, and to really consider that as well as all of these other things that people are talking about now.
Yeah, that's critical, Bara. I completely agree with you, which actually reminds me, there was one time I was working with a candidate who came from a family business background and they hadn't been to a formal university. They studied via correspondence, as it's known here, which was distance learning, so to speak. And so they didn't have as much exposure to peers, and one of the things they were really worried about was their attire. And so I offered to go with them, when they were going to buy their attire for their interviews. And I think that just helped them calm their nerves as well. So even something like having, your attire picked out in advance, your makeup or whatever else you may need,
Exactly.
having all of that set up can also help to soothe those nerves. And Eric also really liked that video example that you shared. Sounds like a great one to check out. I'm definitely going to check it out later.
Yeah, go back to that old adage, you can never be too overdressed. You can certainly be underdressed. And some people who may be working at a tech startup, I'm thinking of the Bay Area, Bara, or anywhere where it's a more informal environment, like remember what you're applying for. These institutions have history and there's tradition, and you're better off erring on the side of caution, being a little bit overdressed. I would say that doesn't mean that you need to be wearing a Chanel suit or having, you know what I mean? Like you don't have to go buy something crazy, but look smart. Go minimal with like makeup and jewelry. If that's what you wear, you want to keep it a professional tone.
I'm just thinking about all the late night shows that I've watched and the differences of how people, show up to, Stephen Colbert. Like some of them are wearing evening gowns. Some of them are wearing really like just beautiful outfits. And then some like are coming in like shorts and sneakers. It's really incredible watching the choices that people make in that format. But this is not that format. This is a very specific business school format. So certain things are going to be accepted. I mean, I imagine that if someone is let's say they are a fashion designer and they make their own clothes and their clothes aren't necessarily formal or simple, would that be an interesting thing that someone would wear? Probably, because that's really expressing who they are and they're coming to it. But if, short of that, I don't know that you want to.
Where I used to work at ESSEC Business School, one of their specialties is this MBA in luxury brand management. So somebody who shows up in something that is a little bit off the traditional line and something that shows their creativity and something that inspires, like that's definitely welcome for a specialized MBA like that. And if you're a fashion designer, like that's like part of your story. So that's very interesting to express that through what you're wearing. You were talking about attire, but also let's talk about how people speak. In today's day and age, I sound so old saying that, we've gotten less and less formal. And I think it's fair to remind the younger generations that you are applying for an interview, you address people as Mr. and Mrs., you shake hands, you make eye contact. It's not like, hey, Donna, how's it going? It's like, how are you, Mr. So-and-so is more appropriate. So keep that in mind, especially if you're dealing with somebody that's a generation or two older than you, what would be expected.
Yeah, and I would like to probably close out with one of the things saying that, send a thank you note to the interviewer later.
Absolutely.
And have an idea about what's going to be the post-interview process, because some of the schools will have different things and so on. We know which schools and so on and so forth. But yeah, don't forget to thank the interviewer. They are doing you a favor, actually. So that should be great. Absolutely. And I believe that we have a question from James. I think, how long should each question take? Especially, take me through your resume.
I'm happy to take that question. Thanks, James. So generally, 1.5 to 2 minutes is the norm that I recommend to my clients. Having said that, take me through your resume is one question where I do think it's okay to go over. And I believe it's acceptable to go up to 3 minutes long as well. Specifically, if you've had a lot of work experience, I do think it can be beneficial to have 3 minutes. Couple other questions where I do think it's okay to go a little bit longer. One is why school, right? So for example, if you're interviewing with Kellogg, why Kellogg? I think that's one question where I believe it's okay to go longer, say up to 3 minutes as well. And also the contributions question. So these are 3 questions where I do think it's absolutely okay to go longer. There are certain schools where you're almost expected to take longer with the starting question. For example, University of Virginia, Darden, for their first question, they give you a lot of time, sometimes as much as 20 minutes even. 10 to 20 minutes is generally what I've seen.
It's about knowing the schools, you're going to adapt your style for each experience. And if there are any other questions from the audience, now is a great time before we wrap up in the next couple of minutes. So send them in if you have any. And our special guest and expert, Nupur, will be happy to answer. Meanwhile, I don't know. I asked Nupur first, and if anyone else wants to share any other advice you want to share about interviewing. We covered a lot of things, so I wouldn't be surprised if there's nothing else. But anything else that comes to mind that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Just one thing which is somewhat related to things we've talked about. We talked about practice, right? So given that, one thing I would recommend is starting with the interview prep right after you submit your applications, or sometimes even earlier. So do not wait until the time you get invited to interview, because sometimes the lead time can be extremely short. And you want to give yourself at least 2 weeks for interview prep. So with that in mind, I would suggest starting your preparation early so that you're not scared, as soon as you get the interview invite. I've seen people being expected to interview within 2 days of getting the invite.
Yes, good advice. It's never too early to start.
Right.
Thanks.
So on that high note and wonderful tips that we got from Nupur, now, thanks so much, everyone, for such a scintillating episode today, where we covered literally everything about interviews and especially the tips and mistakes. But that's the time that we have for today. And thanks to all our guests for the wonderful questions as well. If you liked today's episode, please don't forget to give us a little thumbs up and, of course, subscribe to the YouTube channel. And don't forget to check us out next week, same time and place. And for full access of upcoming and past episodes, head to mbawaves.com. Bye for today. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.